After years of endless deployments and the horrors of war, the Marine finally touched down on familiar soil. It had been so long since she felt the solid ground beneath her boots, the sound of the plane engines still echoing in her ears. As she stepped off into the bright sun of her hometown, she could almost taste the air of safety, the peace that came with returning home. She had been through hell and back, and all she wanted was to be reunited with the one companion who had made those battles bearable. Her war dog, he had been by her side from the very beginning, through the scorching heat of the desert and the freezing nights of foreign lands. He was her partner, her protector, a bond forged in blood and sweat. She could never forget the way he would nudge her gently with his snout after a tough mission, or how his presence had given her strength when fear threatened to consume her. They were a team, nothing could break that connection. It was that bond she was coming home for, and as the days passed during her journey back, the thought of seeing him again kept her going. It was the only thing that made the long trip bearable. She imagined the reunion in her mind over and over. Every detail was vivid in her head. She would open the door to the yard, and there he would be waiting, tail wagging, as if the years of separation had been nothing more than a few moments in time together again. Their joy would be so overwhelming, she could already feel her heart swell at the thought. But as she drew closer to the house, the excitement started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The familiar street was lined with trees and houses, all unchanged by time, but something felt different, something was off. When she reached the end of the road, her heart skipped a beat. There was her childhood home, the place where it all began, yet something about the house seemed distant, almost cold. It wasn't the welcoming sight she had dreamed of in her mind. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something she didn't understand. Her eyes scanned the yard, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. And then there it was in the far corner of the yard, something that shouldn't be there, a figure chained to a post. The dog, he was just standing there, so still in the sunlight, looking like a shadow of the companion. She remembered his body seemed smaller than before, his fur matted and dirty, and in his eyes she saw something that nearly broke her. His spirit was gone. There was no excitement, no joy, no recognition. It was as if the light in him had been snuffed out over time. Her breath caught in her throat, and without thinking she rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. What was happening? Why was he there, chained and alone? The world seemed to slow down as she moved toward him, her mind reeling in disbelief. This wasn't the reunion she had imagined at all. This was a nightmare, a betrayal of everything she had fought for, everything they had fought for together. Her hands shook as she reached for the chain and gently tried to untangle it, her voice barely a whisper as she called out his name. But when his eyes met hers, it was not the greeting she had hoped for. It was something darker, something filled with sorrow and pain. She stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring into the eyes of the dog who had been her constant companion through the worst of battles. His eyes held no warmth, no joy, only a deep sadness that seemed to weigh down on him like an invisible burden. The dog had never been this still before. He had always been full of life, eager to spring into action with the slightest command, but now he seemed like a shell of the animal she once knew, his body frail and thin, his coat dirty and matted. It was as if time had ravaged him in the years since she left, but she couldn't understand how this could have happened. Why was he chained up in the yard? Why had no one cared for him? Why had he been left to suffer in silence? She crouched down to his level, trying to comfort him, but when she reached for his fur, he flinched and pulled away, as if he had forgotten the touch of someone who had once been his trusted partner. The sight shattered her heart into pieces. She had fought alongside this dog through gunfire, explosions, and the harshest conditions. They had shared a bond forged in the fires of war, and now here he was alone and forgotten. Her chest tightened as she spoke his name again, her voice thick with emotion, but he just stared at her, not moving, as if he couldn't believe it was truly her. It was then that a terrible thought began to form in her mind. Had they abandoned him? Had they simply forgotten about him after all the years of service? Had the military promised to care for him only to leave him to suffer and wither away? This wasn't right. This wasn't what they had told her when she left. They had promised that the dog would be well cared for, that he would be given the rest and comfort he deserved after all the lives he had saved, all the dangers he had faced at her side. She had trusted them to keep their word, but now it seemed like everything she had fought for had been betrayed. Her hands trembled as she carefully untied the chain that bound him to the post. It was rusted and old, the metal cutting into the dog's fur. She wondered how long he had been left here like this. It was impossible to comprehend the thought of her loyal companion being left to waste away in such a way. The anger within her began to rise, but it was quickly overtaken by a sense of guilt. How could she have let this happen? How could she have trusted the system that had promised to care for him while she was gone? As she stood up, she looked around the yard, trying to make sense of the situation. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. The grass had overgrown, the house seemed empty. There was no sign of life except for the dog, who was still sitting there staring at her. The silence hung heavy in the air. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead she simply gathered the dog into her arms and held him close. She had no idea what had happened to him or who was responsible for his suffering. But one thing was clear: she would not leave him like this. She would find out the truth, no matter what it took. And she would make sure he would never be forgotten again. As she held the dog in her arms, she could feel his ribs pressing against her chest. His body was so frail, she could barely believe it. This wasn't the dog she had fought beside. This wasn't the dog who had rushed into battle beside her with unshakable courage. This was a shadow of that loyal warrior, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily on her heart. But as she cradled him closer, she knew there was no turning back now. She couldn't just walk away. She couldn't leave him here to suffer alone. She had to find out what had happened to him, who had failed him, who had let this happen. Her first instinct was to go inside the house to find some answers, but the front door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone around. The house was eerily quiet. It felt like a place frozen in time, as if no one had been here for years. Her eyes scanned the yard, searching for any clues, any sign of life, but there was nothing. The entire property looked abandoned. The only movement came from the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze and the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Determined to get answers, she walked around the house to the back gate, hoping to find someone who could explain what had happened to the dog. But the gate was also locked, and there was still no sign of life. She knocked on a few of the neighboring doors, but each house was either empty or the people inside seemed reluctant to talk. When they saw the dog in her arms, their faces twisted with discomfort and avoidance. No one would tell her anything. It was as if everyone knew something she didn't, and they were all too afraid to speak up. Frustration began to bubble up inside her. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. The dog needed her. She needed to know the truth, and she would stop at nothing to get it. She carefully placed the dog down on the porch for a moment, brushing his fur gently as she thought back to the time when she had been deployed, when she had said goodbye to him before heading out on her last mission. She remembered the promise she had made to him, that she would come back and they would be together again. But she never imagined it would be like this. She had trusted the military to care for him, to make sure he was safe and healthy. But this sight was the complete opposite of what she had hoped for. She paced back and forth on the porch, trying to think of where to go next, when her mind landed on one possibility, one person who might know something: the former handler of the dog, the man who had trained him and had worked alongside him for years. She remembered the letters and phone calls she had received while she was deployed, how he had promised that the dog was doing well, that he was in good hands. But something told her now that those promises had been empty words. It was time to track him down and demand the truth, no matter where it led. Taking a deep breath, she stood tall and looked down at the dog. He was still staring at her with those sad eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't alone in this. They weren't alone. She had a mission again, and this time it wasn't about the battlefield. It was about loyalty. It was about getting justice for a war dog who had been left behind, a dog who had once saved lives and who now needed to be saved in return. She would find the answers she needed and bring those responsible to justice, no matter how long it took, no matter what it took. She stood there for a moment longer, gazing down at the dog, who still looked up at her with those sorrowful eyes. And as the weight of the moment settled in, she knew one thing for sure: This wasn't just about her, it wasn't just about her dog. This was about all the other war dogs who had been abandoned, forgotten, or neglected after their service to the country. This was a problem that had gone unchecked for too long, and now it was her fight to expose the truth. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't allow this to be the way the story ended for her dog. Determined, she set off to find the former handler. She had to know the truth. She had to get to the bottom of this. Her mind raced as she retraced the steps of her time in service and tried to remember any details that could lead her to the man who had once worked closely with the dog. She pulled out her phone and searched through old contacts, but most of them were either outdated or disconnected. After all the years since her deployment, she realized how little she truly knew about the fate of those she had left behind. She refused to give up, and after some time she remembered a fellow Marine who had kept in touch with the handler. The man had been an integral part of the training program for war dogs and might have been able to help. It took some more calls and texts, but eventually she managed to get a lead. Someone had heard from him recently, and they provided her with an address. It was in a small town a few hours away, but she wasn't going to let anything stop her now. She packed her things, gathered the dog into her arms again, and set off on the journey. There was no turning back. She had a sense of urgency that she couldn't shake. No matter how much time had passed, she knew that every minute was a minute lost, and she needed answers. She wasn't sure what she would find when she arrived, but she was prepared to face whatever it took. The car ride felt like it stretched on forever, and with each passing mile her thoughts only became more focused on the dog's condition. She couldn't stop thinking about how weak he had looked, how lifeless his body had felt in her arms, how he had suffered in silence all this time. When she finally arrived at the small town, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. The house she pulled up to was modest and seemed to blend into its surroundings, but there was something about it that made her pulse quicken. She had no idea what would happen when she knocked on the door, but she was ready for whatever answers might come her way. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her heart racing as she approached the door, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, guilt, determination. She knocked sharply on the door and waited. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating, as if time itself was holding its breath. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and just when she thought she might have to turn away, the door creaked open slowly, and a man appeared standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable at first. But when his eyes landed on the dog in her arms, his face fell into a mask of guilt and shame. Before he could speak, she blurted out the question that had been burning inside her since the moment she found the dog chained in the yard. What happened to him? Why was he left behind? She demanded, her voice shaking but firm. She wouldn't back down now. The man stood there silent for a moment, his eyes flickering between the dog in her arms and her face. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out at first. It was as though he was caught in some sort of inner struggle, struggling to find the right words, or perhaps struggling to face the reality of what had happened. He stepped back from the doorway and motioned for her to come inside. She hesitated for a moment, but then made her way into the house, still holding the dog close to her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the truth that was about to be revealed. Once inside, he closed the door behind them and motioned for her to sit on the couch, but she remained standing, refusing to sit down until she had the answers she needed. The man sighed deeply and ran a hand through his graying hair before sitting down across from her. His eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow, but there was something else too, something like resignation, as though he had been carrying this burden for far too long. He began to speak slowly, as if he was carefully choosing his words. "I don't know where to start," he said, his voice quiet and strained. "I never wanted this to happen. I swore when he was assigned to me that I would take care of him, that I would always make sure he had what he needed." He paused and swallowed hard. "But when the deployments ended and the mission was over, I guess things got complicated." He glanced at the dog, who was now lying in her arms, his eyes closed as though he had finally found some small comfort in her presence. The man continued, "The military promised that they would find a good home for him after the last mission. I thought they were going to take care of him properly, But the system isn't like we were told. It was all supposed to be part of the transition. They told me they'd find him a place to rest, a good home somewhere safe. But they didn't. He looked down at his hands, as though he couldn't bear to look at her face as he spoke the words. The guilt in his voice was thick and painful as he spoke of the time after the deployment when the military had dropped the ball and left the dog behind with no plan for his future. He explained that the hunter was told that the dog would be transferred to a facility where he could live out his retirement with the same care he had been given during his service, but somewhere along the way the promises broke down and the dog was left in limbo, forgotten, abandoned to fend for himself. The anger inside her started to boil over. She had trusted the system, she had trusted the military to care for her dog, the dog who had given everything for them, and now here he was broken, neglected, and abandoned. For what reason she didn't understand. The pain in her chest was overwhelming. She had never felt more betrayed in her life. "Why didn't you do something? Why didn't you fight for him?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. He looked up at her now, his eyes filled with regret. "I tried," he said quietly. "I tried to get answers. I tried to find out what happened to him. But every time I hit a wall, they just kept telling me that they had no resources or they had no room or whatever excuse they came up with. I couldn't do anything on my own, not when they kept shutting me out." Her fists clenched at her sides, her jaw tightened with frustration, but she didn't say anything for a long moment as the weight of what he had just told her settled in. She had been betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect her dog, just as it had protected her. It was the same system that had abandoned so many others, and she couldn't allow it to continue, not when she was this close to finding the truth. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze and spoke with newfound determination. "Then it's not over yet. I'm going to make sure he gets the justice he deserves, and I'm going to make sure no one else's dog is abandoned like this ever again." Her voice was steady with conviction, but the fire burning inside her was only growing stronger. The man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. He seemed to understand the depth of her resolve, but at the same time he seemed afraid of what might come next. He had tried and failed to make a difference, but now she was here with a determination he hadn't seen in years, and it was clear that she wouldn't back down no matter what. But as much as he wanted to support her, there was a heaviness in his chest, a fear that the truth would be too much to bear. She could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the fear of retribution from the very system that had failed them both, and as much as she understood it, she couldn't afford to let it stop her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear dictate her next move. The dog had suffered enough, and she had to be the one to make sure that no other animal would face this fate again. She took a deep breath and began to formulate a plan. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, and she needed to start making waves in the right places. She had to reach out to the right people, people who had the power to expose the truth. She had to contact fellow Marines, other soldiers who had served with her, and the dog people who could speak up about the bond they shared and the way the system had failed them. She had to get in touch with organizations that fought for animal rights, particularly military animals like her dog, and together they would make sure the truth came to light. She turned back to the man sitting across from her, his face still full of guilt, but also a flicker of hope. Now that she had a plan, he could see that she wasn't going to give up on this, not on him and not on the dog. "I'm going to need your help," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I need you to help me get in touch with anyone who can expose what happened here. I don't care about the consequences. We have to make sure this never happens again." He nodded slowly, his face still filled with regret, but now there was something else to, a sense of purpose. Something in her words had reignited a spark in him, the same way the dog had once ignited the courage to fight alongside her on those dangerous missions. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been hiding from this for too long. Maybe it's time I did something about it. Maybe it's time we did something." With that, the two of them began to make calls, reaching out to organizations that supported war dogs and veterans. They contacted former handlers and trainers from the military dog program, anyone who could shed light on the system's failings. anyone who could help bring justice to the dogs who had been left behind. They began to gather their evidence, putting together a case that would hopefully expose the truth of the military's neglect. But it wasn't just about exposing the betrayal, it was about giving the dog a second chance at life and giving him the care he had been denied for so long. She knew the fight would be difficult, the system would fight back, and there would be obstacles at every turn. But she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had the support of people who cared about the dogs and the warriors who had served by their side, and with each step they took, she could feel the walls of silence beginning to crack. It wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to happen overnight, but she was determined to see it through for the dog who had given everything for her, and for the countless others who had been forgotten just like him. No one would be able to ignore them anymore. She would make sure of that. She would make sure the world knew the truth. Days turned into weeks as she and the former handler worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a case. They contacted everyone they could think of, reaching out to fellow veterans, animal rights groups, former military personnel who had dealt with war dogs firsthand. It wasn't easy. Many were hesitant to speak out, afraid of the consequences, afraid of angering the very system that had once promised them protection. But slowly, piece by piece, they began to uncover the layers of neglect and betrayal that had been hidden for so long. The more they uncovered, the angrier she became, the more determined she was to bring the truth to light. With each phone call, each meeting with someone who had been part of the military's dog program, the picture became clearer. The system was broken, and the dogs who had served loyally were being cast aside when they were no longer needed. Some were left to live out their days in kennels, others abandoned like her dog, left to suffer in silence while the military moved on to the next mission. It was a cruel cycle, one that had been ignored for far too long, but now she was going to make sure it was exposed. Through late nights of research, phone calls, and meetings, they finally managed to get in touch with a few key journalists who were willing to take on the story. These journalists had covered military scandals before, and they were disgusted by what had happened to these dogs. They knew the story would make headlines, and with their help, they were able to push the issue to the forefront of the news cycle. When the first article was published, it didn't take long for the outrage to spread. The public was shocked to learn of the way these loyal animals had been abandoned by the very people who had promised to care for them. The media coverage snowballed quickly. Social media exploded with stories of war dogs who had been left behind, abandoned to suffer, and soon the pressure mounted on the military to answer for their actions. The military could no longer hide behind their bureaucracy. The truth was out, and the world was watching. But even as the story gained momentum, she knew the battle wasn't over. There were still those who wanted to bury the truths, still those who would do everything they could to protect the system that had allowed this to happen. The dog's case was only one of many, and the fight was just beginning. She prepared for a long legal battle, a battle that would require every ounce of strength she had. But she wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. As the months passed, more and more former handlers and veterans came forward to tell their stories. Some of them had fought the system for years, only to be silenced. Others were just now finding the courage to speak up. But each of them played a part in the larger movement that was growing stronger with every passing day, and with every story shared, she knew they were closer to making real change. Through it all, the dog remained by her side. His health improved with the care and love she had given him. But it was the emotional healing that was most important. He was no longer the broken animal she had found chained in the yard. He was becoming the dog she remembered, loyal, strong, and full of life. They had both been through so much, but together they were healing, finding their way back to the bond that had once been unbreakable. And as the story of the abandoned war dogs continued to unfold across the media, the military began to make changes. The pressure became too great, and slowly but surely reforms were put into place. Programs were created to ensure that no war dog would ever be forgotten again. But none of it would have happened if she hadn't refused to give up, if she hadn't fought for what was right. In the end, she and her dog had not only found each other again, but they had sparked a movement that would forever change the way the world treated these loyal animals, and for that she knew she had made a difference. Together, they had made the impossible possible, and the fight would continue until no more war dogs were left behind.